The first sign wasn't a sky split open or a fleet of warships blotting out the stars. It was a hum. It started subtly, a low C-sharp that seemed to emanate not from any specific direction, but from the fillings in your teeth and the marrow of your bones. Most people didn't even notice it, writing it off as tinnitus or the thrum of a distant power station, but Elias Thorne noticed. He noticed everything. It was a professional curse. He sat in the dusty, languid heat of his New Orleans bookshop. The faded page, a mausoleum for forgotten words, and the hum made the 17th century vellum on his desk feel slick and alien beneath his fingertips. He was a former combat linguist, a man who had once been paid to find the hidden meanings in whispers and static, and this new global frequency felt like a word he couldn't translate, a syntax error in the code of reality. Then came the ships. They weren't weapons of war. They were sculptures of light and logic, crystalline lattices that descended through the clouds without displacing a single molecule of air, silent and perfect. They hung over every major city like chandeliers in a ballroom for giants, pulsing with a soft, placid, iridescent light. There was no ultimatum, no declaration of war. A voice, smooth and genderless, spoke inside every human mind at the same instant. It wasn't a broadcast. It was a thought, planted as neatly as a pansy in a flower pot. "You are noisy," it said in every language, dead or living. "Your data is corrupt. We are the Vex. We have come to curate." The world didn't panic. How could it? The hum intensified, and with it came a sense of profound, unshakable calm. Riots didn't happen. The stock market didn't crash. In fact, it stabilized with unnerving perfection. World leaders, who a day earlier were rattling sabers over dwindling oil fields, met in emergency sessions and emerged with agreements of unprecedented cooperation. The Vex called it the Harmony. It spread from the cities outward, a psychic wave of pure, unadulterated reason. Crime rates fell to zero overnight. A man in Chicago who was about to stab his neighbor over a parking dispute suddenly paused, recognized the inefficiency of his actions, and instead offered to help repaint the faded lines on the asphalt. A war-torn village in the Congo laid down its arms, not in surrender, but in a shared moment of lucid understanding that their conflict was based on suboptimal emotional variables. It was paradise, delivered by angels made of chrome and algorithm. Elias Thorne felt it as a creeping numbness, a bland fog that threatened to smother the beautiful, chaotic mess of his mind. He was an alcoholic, a purveyor of lies, and a student of dead languages. His entire existence was a monument to inefficiency. He poured himself a glass of bourbon, the expensive kind he saved for the end of the world, and found the familiar burn had been replaced by a simple chemical sensation on his tongue. The pleasure, the ritual, the self-loathing, all of it was being sandpapered away by the harmony. The first real crack in the Vex's perfect world appeared a week later. A woman named Mrs. Gable, a regular who had cried in his shop a year ago while buying a book of poetry to read at her husband's funeral, came in with a small, leather-bound volume. It was a first edition of Leaves of Grass, with a tender, heartfelt inscription from her late husband on the flyleaf. "I'd like to sell this," she said, her voice as flat and colorless as a concrete sidewalk. Elias took the book, his hands tracing the familiar weight of it. "Are you sure? Eleanor, this meant the world to you." She blinked, her eyes clear and untroubled by memory. It is an inefficient storage medium for redundant emotional data. Its market value would be better allocated to upgrading my home's nutritional paste dispenser." He stared at her, at the placid void where a grieving widow used to be, and felt a coldness the bourbon couldn't touch. The Vex weren't killing people, they were editing them. They were deleting the footnotes of the human soul, the messy, beautiful, contradictory scribbles in the margins that made the story worth reading. He refused the sale, telling her the book was a worthless forgery, a lie that felt more true than anything else in the world at that moment. She nodded, accepting his assessment without question, and left the book on the counter, forgotten. That night, Elias did something he hadn't done since he was discharged. He tried to access the old military back channels. Most were silent. The operators likely harmonized into blissful complacency. But he found one, a heavily encrypted node favored by spooks and conspiracy nuts, a digital sewer pipe still gushing with the unfiltered noise of human paranoia. He put out a simple message, not a call to arms, but a question. Is anyone else still hearing the music? The replies trickled in, not from generals or politicians, but from the fringes. A jazz trumpeter in Harlem who said the harmony was turning his improvisations into predictable scales. A schizophrenic in Portland whose auditory hallucinations were now arguing with the Vex's voice in his head, creating a terrifying internal cacophony. A historian in London who had found herself unable to recall the passion and fervor of the French Revolution, only its statistical outcomes. They were the glitches, the deviants, the minds too steeped in chaos, art, and madness for the harmony to easily pave over. They were the ones who understood that a world without grief, rage, or pointless laughter was a cage, no matter how comfortable. A plan began to form in the haze of Elias's bourbon-soaked mind. He couldn't fight the Vex's technology. You couldn't shoot a psychic field. You couldn't bomb a feeling of placid contentment. But the Vex's strength was also their weakness. They were logical. They operated on data, on predictable patterns. Elias dealt in the opposite. He dealt in stories, in the glorious, infuriating, illogical narratives that humanity had been telling itself since the first caveman grunted about the one that got away. A story is a virus of the mind. It bypasses reason and logic and plugs directly into the soul. What he needed was a broadcast tower, a pirate radio station, something off the grid and loud enough to punch a hole in the suffocating blanket of the harmony. His contacts in the digital sewer pointed him toward the Louisiana swamps, to a legend known only as Mama Nightingale. She supposedly ran a blues station from a shack on stilts, powered by a salvaged generator and fueled by pure spite, broadcasting music that was too raw and painful for the mainstream even before the aliens showed up. It took him 2 days to find her, navigating the bayou in a sputtering skiff, the air thick with humidity and the silence of harmonized alligators. The shack was a wreck, patched with corrugated tin and draped in Spanish moss. But a tall, defiant antenna scraped the sky. Inside, a woman as old as the cypress trees themselves sat surrounded by vinyl records and vacuum tubes, her face a roadmap of hard-lived years. She looked him up and down, her eyes sharp and intelligent. "You're one of them, ain't you?" she rasped, her voice like gravel and honey. "One of the ones who still remembers how to get angry." Elias nodded. "They're turning us into ghosts. I want to remind people what it feels like to be haunted." She cackled, a dry, rattling sound. "The Vex, they've been trying to harmonize my blues, trying to tell me my baby leaving me was a suboptimal social outcome. I told him my baby leaving me was the reason I can make a guitar cry. They don't understand that hurt is a type of fuel. She gestured to a vintage microphone sitting on a table cluttered with wires and soldering tools. So, Bookman, you got a story that hurts enough to wake the dead. Elias sat down, the hum of the Vex pressing in on him, urging him to be calm, to be reasonable, to accept the inevitable peace. He fought it, dredging up the ugliest, most beautifully human thing he could think of. It was a memory from his time in the service, a Black Ops mission in some God-forsaken desert that had gone sideways. He had been tasked with interrogating a captured insurgent, a young man who had seen his entire family killed in a drone strike. The official report stated that Elias had extracted vital intelligence through approved psychological techniques. The truth was far messier. The truth was that for 12 hours, he and the young man had simply traded stories. Elias told him about his alcoholic father, about the girl who broke his heart in college, about the time he'd gotten ridiculously drunk and stolen a police horse. The insurgent told him about his wife's laugh, about the taste of his mother's bread, about the nursery rhyme he sang to his daughter. They hadn't talked about war or tactics or gods. They talked about being human. At the end, the young man had told him everything, not because he was broken, but because, for a few hours, he hadn't felt like an enemy. He'd felt like a man. The official report was a lie Elias had created to protect them both, a fabrication of poetic resonance that had gotten him kicked out of the military. Mama Nightingale flipped a switch. The generator outside groaned, and a warm static filled the room. The on-air light glowed a defiant red. Elias leaned into the microphone, the metallic smell of it filling his nostrils, and he began to speak. He didn't shout or preach. He just told the story. He told it with all the profanity, all the sorrow, all the dark, absurd humor of the memory itself. He described the taste of the sand, the feel of the sweat on his skin, the look in the young man's eyes when he spoke of his dead child. He didn't offer a moral or a solution. He just offered the raw, bleeding, unedited data of a human experience. He spoke of love and loss and failure, of the profound, illogical loyalty two enemies had shared in a dusty tent surrounded by death. As he spoke, something began to happen. The harmony, the ever-present hum, began to flicker. In a nearby town, a man driving his perfectly efficient electric vehicle suddenly pulled over. The Vex-induced calm in his mind pierced by a phantom memory of his brother, who had died years ago. He hadn't cried at the funeral. It had been an orderly processing of grief. Now, he wept, the sobs racking his body, the pain so sharp and real it felt like a homecoming. In a diner, a waitress who had been serving nutritional paste with robotic politeness dropped a tray, not out of clumsiness, but because she suddenly remembered a stupid, off-color joke her grandfather used to tell, and a laugh, a real, ugly, gut-busting laugh, erupted from her, shocking everyone in the silent room. The chaos was spreading. The virus was taking hold. The Vex, in their perfect, crystalline ships, felt it as a surge of corrupted data, a blast of pure, nonsensical noise that their algorithms couldn't parse. Their purpose was to bring clarity, and here, in a fetid swamp on a dying planet, a single human was broadcasting pure, weaponized confusion. High above, a single Vex ship detached from the main lattice. It was smaller than the others, sleeker, and it didn't pulse with a calm, white light. It glowed a clinical, analytical blue. It wasn't a curator. It was a corrector drone, a digital antibody designed to locate and delete corrupted files. It descended silently, effortlessly. Its sensors locked on the source of the illogical broadcast, a straight, clean line of logic streaking through the swamp toward a tin-roofed shack where an old woman was tapping her foot to the rhythm of a broken man telling a story about what it meant to be human. The corrector drone did not descend with the roar of engines or the whine of anti-gravity. It simply arrived, its presence a sudden or sharp fact in the humid air above the shack. It was a perfect sphere of obsidian, its surface shifting with silent, complex geometric patterns that seemed to fold in on themselves. A four-dimensional object crammed uncomfortably into a three-dimensional world. It hung there, 20 feet above the cypress canopy, and the harmony intensified tenfold, a crushing weight of pure reason that demanded compliance. Inside the shack, the vacuum tubes of Mama Nightingale's broadcast rig glowed a hotter orange, and the static between Elias's words hissed like a cornered snake. Mama Nightingale didn't even look up at the viewport. She just closed her eyes and tapped a gnarled finger on the table, keeping a rhythm only she could hear. "They don't like the B-side," she muttered, a grim smile playing on her lips. "Never did." The drone didn't speak with a voice. Instead, it projected knowledge directly into their minds. Elias felt an instantaneous, intrusive understanding of his own biology. He saw his liver, scarred by years of alcohol, and was presented with a detailed, color-coded flowchart illustrating the inefficiency of ethanol metabolism. He saw the neural pathways in his brain that fired when he felt sorrow, labeled as legacy code artifacts, and was offered a seamless psychic patch to overwrite them with a more stable contentment algorithm. It wasn't an attack. It was an unsolicited system update. For Mama Nightingale, the projection was different. She saw the physics of her own music, the sound waves broken down into their constituent frequencies, the emotional responses they triggered in the human brain categorized as minor, predictable hormonal fluctuations. Her life's work, the raw soul of the Delta Blues, was presented to her as a simple, solvable equation. She opened her eyes, the defiant fire in them burning brighter. "The hell you say," she whispered, and she reached over, nudging the volume knob on her amplifier just a little bit higher. Elias felt his resolve wavering. The drone's logic was seductive, undeniable. It showed him a world without his guilt, without the phantom weight of the men he'd lost, without the gnawing, pointless ache for a past he couldn't reclaim. It offered him peace, a clean, sterile, well-lit peace. But then he looked at the first edition of Leaves of Grass he had brought with him from the shop, its pages yellowed and soft as old skin, and he remembered Eleanor Gable's empty eyes. This wasn't peace. It was erasure. He leaned back into the microphone, his voice a ragged whisper against the oppressive psychic calm. "You think you understand data," he broadcast. Not to the world this time, but directly at the sphere. "Let me give you some more." He didn't tell a story of valor or tragedy. He told the drone about a Tuesday in his childhood, a day of profound and magnificent stupidity. He told it about the time he and his best friend, a boy named Leo, who would later die in a meaningless car accident, decided to liberate all the gnomes from the gardens in their suburban neighborhood. There was no political motive, no grand purpose. They did it because the idea, whispered in the dark of a treehouse, had made them laugh so hard they couldn't breathe. He described the thrill of sneaking through manicured lawns, The ridiculous weight of a ceramic gnome with a fishing pole, the silent, conspiratorial grin on Leo's face in the moonlight. He recounted how they had arranged all 200 gnomes in the town square, placing them in bizarre, nonsensical tableaus, a gnome tea party, a gnome poker game, a gnome funeral for a fallen squirrel. The next morning, the town had erupted not in anger, but in baffled amusement. For one day, the rigid, predictable order of their lives had been fractured by a single, pointless act of chaotic joy. "There's no algorithm for that," Elias rasped into the mic. "What's the optimal outcome of a gnome revolution? What's the market value of a memory of your best friend laughing so hard he snorted milk out of his nose? You can't curate that. You can't patch it. It's useless. And it's everything." The geometric patterns on the corrector's surface stuttered. The flowcharts in Elias's mind flickered and dissolved into static. The drone was trying to process the gnome's story, trying to assign it a value, to fit it into a logical framework, and it was failing. It was like feeding a sonnet to a calculator. The data was corrupt. It was illogical. It was a joke. As the drone faltered, Mama Nightingale laid her hands on an old, scarred acoustic guitar. She didn't play a song. She just played a single, dissonant chord, bent and warped with a bottleneck slide. It was a sound full of rust and rain and whiskey, a sound that held a lifetime of defiance in its vibrating strings. It was the sound of a scraped knee. It was the sound of a slammed door. It was the sound of a human heart refusing to beat in a predictable rhythm. The combination of Elias's illogical narrative and Mama Nightingale's mathematically imperfect music was too much. A low-frequency shudder vibrated through the shack. The obsidian sphere's surface glitched, its perfect patterns momentarily collapsing into a chaotic fuzz of visual noise. Then, as silently as it arrived, it ascended, retreating back into the clouds, not in victory, but in confusion. It was a tactical withdrawal. It had encountered an error it could not compute and had gone to report back to the system administrator. Silence fell in the shack, broken only by the hum of the cooling tubes and Elias's ragged breathing. He had won, but he knew it was just the first exchange in a war nobody else knew was being fought, thousands of miles away. In a decommissioned NORAD bunker deep within the Cheyenne Mountain Complex, a woman known as Kestrel watched the Vex network on a bank of holographic monitors. Her real name was lost to a dozen deleted identities, but in the dark corners of the web, she was a legend, an architect of digital ghosts and untraceable data havens. She had seen the Vex's arrival not as an invasion, but as the ultimate denial of service attack on human consciousness. For weeks, she had been mapping their psychic network, searching for a vulnerability, an exploit she could use. The Harmony was a perfect piece of code, self-replicating, self-repairing, flawless. But just moments ago, she had seen it. A flicker, a single node in the global network, had momentarily desynchronized, its data stream corrupted by a massive influx of what the Vex system logs could only classify as semantic paradoxes and non-Euclidean emotional geometry. It was a ghost packet, an analog piece of malware that had somehow infected the Vex's pristine code. Tracing its origin was difficult. It wasn't digital. It was coming from a low-tech, high-power radio signal originating from a swamp in Louisiana. Kestrel leaned forward, her face illuminated by the cascading lines of code. She isolated the audio, filtering out the static, and listen to the end of Elias Thorne's story about the garden gnomes. A slow, rare smile spread across her face. It was the most brilliantly stupid thing she had ever heard. It was a buffer overflow attack on the soul. These aliens, with their perfect logic and their crystalline ships, had a firewall, but it had a gaping vulnerability. It couldn't process absurdity. Kestrel's fingers flew across her custom keyboard. The Vex had locked down the internet, smoothing its chaotic tangle into an efficient, predictable utility. But Kestrel didn't live on their internet. She lived in the shadows, in the forgotten satellite relays and deep-sea fiber optic cables the Vex hadn't bothered to curate. She began to hunt for others like herself. For the other glitches the system couldn't smooth over. She found the jazz trumpeter in Harlem, whose chaotic, improvisational music was a constant source of low-level data corruption for the Vex in his neighborhood. She found the historian in London, who had begun a project of illogical archiving, writing down historical accounts that focused entirely on passion, folly, and contradiction, ignoring dates and statistics. She found the schizophrenic in Portland, whose fractured consciousness was proving to be an impenetrable fortress of noise that the harmony couldn't breach. She sent them all a single, encrypted message, piggybacked on the residual frequency of Elias's broadcast. The message contained no words. Only two things: a recording of Mama Nightingale's discordant guitar chord, and a set of coordinates pointing to the Cheyenne Mountain bunker. This wasn't going to be a resistance of bombs and bullets. It was going to be a network of poets, artists, madmen, and musicians. It was going to be an orchestra of static. Their mission wasn't to destroy the Vex, but to annoy them, to confuse them, to deharmonize them with a constant, relentless barrage of beautiful, pointless, human noise. Back in the swamp, a small, ancient dot matrix printer wired to a shortwave receiver in the corner of the shack sputtered to life. Elias watched as it slowly, painfully printed out a single line of text from an unknown sender. It read louder. He looked at Mama Nightingale, who was already tuning her guitar. The fight was far from over, but for the first time since the hum had started, he felt the cold, familiar, and exquisitely inefficient flicker of hope. They had the Vex's attention. Now, they were going to put on a show. The Cheyenne Mountain bunker was less a military installation and more a museum of forgotten anxieties. Kestrel had found it abandoned, a Cold War relic the Vex had deemed strategically irrelevant, its hardened steel doors and miles of copper wiring too archaic for their seamless, energy-based systems. She had turned it into the world's most secure pirate radio station. When Elias and Mama Nightingale arrived, guided by a series of cryptic breadcrumb messages, they found a small, strange tribe already assembling in the cavernous command center. There was Marcus, the jazz trumpeter from Harlem, a man who spoke in scat-like rhythms and whose trumpet case was covered in stickers of quantum physics equations. There was Dr. Alistair Finch, the London historian, a frail man with a will of iron, who had digitized his library of illogical histories onto vintage, magnetically unstable hard drives, convinced their decay would add an extra layer of entropic noise. And there was Sarah, the young woman from Portland, whose schizophrenia was not a disability here, but a superpower. Her mind was a natural encryption engine, a constant storm of competing narratives and auditory hallucinations that the Vex's harmony couldn't penetrate. She sat in a corner, sketching in a notebook, occasionally looking up and whispering. The Blue King says they can't taste irony. It's a flavor profile they lack. Kestrel, a pale figure who seemed to subsist entirely on caffeine and the glow of her monitors, greeted them not with a handshake, but with a data stream. "Welcome to the static," she said, her voice a synthesized whisper from a speaker on the wall. "You are all anomalies. Your cognitive patterns generate a high degree of informational entropy. In layman's terms, your brains are messy. The Vex can't clean you, so they've started flagging you for deletion." She brought up a holographic map of the globe, overlaid with the shimmering, lattice-like network of the Vex's psychic field. Here and there, tiny red dots flickered. "These are people like us. Glitches." A stand-up comedian in Mumbai whose punchlines are causing localized harmony disruptions. A performance artist in Berlin who has been silently miming the entire history of human suffering in a public square. A dementia patient in a Florida nursing home whose jumbled memories are a constant source of corrupted data the Vex can't reconcile. She pointed to a cluster of red dots that had recently gone dark. "The corrector drones are getting more efficient. They aren't trying to fix us anymore. They're pruning the network." Their first mission was to find a way to amplify their noise, to turn their individual static into a global broadcast that could shield the other glitches. The problem was power. The bunker's old nuclear generator could keep the lights on, but to punch a signal through the Vex's global harmony field would require a phenomenal amount of energy, more than any single source on Earth could provide. It was Alistair, the historian, who found the answer, not in an engineering schematic, but in a dusty, forgotten psychological warfare manual from the 1950s. "Operation Acoustic Kitty," he murmured, his eyes gleaming. "The CIA tried to use cats as listening devices. It was a spectacular, expensive, and utterly absurd failure. The cats, being cats, refused to follow orders. They wandered off, got hungry, fell asleep in the sun." He tapped a frail finger on the page. "The principle, however, is fascinating. They were trying to create a decentralized, autonomous surveillance network. We need to do the same, but for broadcasting." The plan was as mad as its inspiration. They wouldn't try to overpower the Vex with a single, massive broadcast. Instead, they would turn every glitch on the planet into a tiny, mobile transmitter. They would hijack the Vex's own network and use it to spread their chaos. Kestrel identified a loophole in the harmony field's architecture. The field was designed to soothe and organize human thought, but to do so, it had to be in a constant state of listening, of data intake. It was a two-way street. If they could craft a signal that mimicked the neural frequency of a human thought, but was filled with illogical, chaotic data, they could inject it directly into the Vex's network. The payload wouldn't be a virus. It would be a story, a joke, a lie, a piece of music so emotionally complex it would act like a logic bomb. Their test subject was Marcus. Kestrel hooked him up to a series of sensors, modified EEG machines wired into her central server. "Play something," she instructed, "but don't just play notes. Play a memory. Play the time you got lost on the subway at age 5. Play the feeling of the vinyl seats, the smell of burnt popcorn, the fear, and the strange, thrilling sense of adventure." Marcus closed his eyes and lifted his trumpet. He didn't play a melody. He played a soundscape, a series of long, mournful notes that perfectly captured a child's loneliness, punctuated by sharp, frantic staccatos that mimicked the screech of the train's wheels and the panic of a racing heart. He ended on a single, triumphant, high C. That was the pure, unadulterated joy of seeing his mother's face on the platform. Kestrel recorded the entire performance not as sound, but as a stream of raw neurological data. The fear, the joy, the confusion, it was all there. A complex, contradictory emotional waveform. "Now," she said, her fingers dancing across the keys. "We give it a wrapper." She encoded Marcus's brainwaves into a carrier signal designed to look like a simple, placid thought, the mental equivalent of a Trojan horse. Her target was a corrector drone currently pacifying a small riot in what used to be Barcelona, a protest that had broken out after the Vex had curated the city's historic Gaudi architecture, smoothing its chaotic, organic curves into efficient, symmetrical shapes. She found a weak point in its local field and, with a single keystroke, injected the subway memory. On the streets of Barcelona, the obsidian sphere of the corrector drone paused its emission of calming frequencies. For a fraction of a second, the crushing weight of the harmony lifted. A man who had been about to peacefully hand his protest sign to a Vex drone suddenly felt a phantom echo of a 5-year-old's panic. It wasn't his memory, but the feeling was undeniably real. He looked at the perfect, symmetrical buildings around him and felt a surge of illogical, childish rage. He threw a rock at the drone. It was a pointless, inefficient gesture. The rock bounced off the drone's surface without leaving a scratch. But it was a start. The drone, its processing cycles momentarily consumed by the nonsensical data of a long-dead memory, faltered. Its internal logs registered a critical error, received emotional data packet with no logical antecedent. Before it could recover, the chaos spread. The seed of doubt planted by the rock thrower blossomed into a full-blown, beautifully human riot. People weren't fighting for freedom or ideology. They were fighting because the cold, sterile perfection of the Vex's world had suddenly been reminded of how it felt to be a lost child on a train. Back in the bunker, the team watched the data feeds with breathless intensity. It had worked. They had weaponized nostalgia. Now, they needed an army of storytellers. Kestrel began to work on a portable version of her device, a small headset that could record a person's neural emotional state and broadcast it in a short, targeted burst. They would send the designs out through the dark web, turning every glitch into a soldier in their war of cognitive dissonance. Their ammunition would be their own lives, their own flawed, messy, and magnificent memories. Elias Thorne took the first prototype. His target was a Vex curation hub in Chicago, a massive crystalline spire that had replaced the Sears Tower, which now served as the central processing node for the entire North American continent. A direct assault was impossible, but Elias wasn't going to use a bomb. He was going to use the most painful and illogical memory he had the day he told his mother, who was dying of a cancer that had stolen her words, a long, elaborate lie. He had sat by her hospital bed for hours and described a future for himself that he knew would never happen. He told her he had met a woman, that he was going to quit his dangerous government job, that they were going to buy a small house and have children. He painted a picture of a life of quiet, simple, boring happiness, a life he knew he was utterly incapable of living. He lied because the truth was too cruel, and the lie gave her a moment of peace before the end. It was an act of profound love, built on a foundation of complete deceit. It was a paradox, a beautiful, heartbreaking contradiction that no algorithm could ever hope to solve. Wearing Kestrel's headset, he stood in a park across from the curation hub, the spire glimmering with cold, logical perfection in the sunlight. He closed his eyes, summoned the memory in all its agonizing detail, the smell of antiseptic, the rasp of his mother's breathing, the weight of her hand in his, and he pressed the broadcast button. Inside the spire, trillions of calculations per second were being processed to optimize traffic patterns, resource distribution, and social contentment. Then Elias's memory hit the central core. It wasn't just data, it was grief, love, and deception, all wrapped into a single, indivisible packet of pure humanity. The spire didn't explode. It did something far stranger. The calm, white light it emitted began to flicker, and for a few seconds, it pulsed a soft, mournful blue. All across the continent, the harmony wavered. The stock market, which had been a perfect, flat line for months, suddenly saw a frantic, inexplicable sell-off of a company that made greeting cards. In 1,000 cities, people simultaneously stopped what they were doing, gripped by a sudden, shared, and completely unprompted feeling of filial guilt. The Vex's perfect system of logic had been infected with a lie told out of love, and it was beginning to glitch. The war had begun, not with a bang, but with a whisper of a memory, a story that hurt too much to be true, and was therefore the most human thing of all. The blue pulse from the Chicago spire lasted for 7 minutes. 7 minutes where? Across an entire continent, the crushing weight of the harmony was replaced by a phantom, inexplicable ache of grief and love. In those 7 minutes, a Vex-optimized factory assembly line in Detroit suddenly began producing car doors that were all left-handed. A perfectly harmonized couple in Denver got into a screaming match about a dream one of them couldn't quite remember. A stockbroker in New York, who for months had only felt a placid satisfaction with market stability, started weeping quietly onto his keyboard for a mother he hadn't spoken to in a decade. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the blue light vanished. The spire returned to its placid white glow, and the harmony snapped back into place, stronger than before, like a rubber band pulled taut and then released. The car factory corrected its error. The couple in Denver apologized for their inefficient emotional outburst. The stockbroker wiped his tears, reran his optimized investment algorithms, and forgot why he had been crying. Back in the Cheyenne Mountain bunker, the small team erupted in a ragged cheer. Mama Nightingale let out a whoop and slapped Elias so hard on the back he nearly coughed up a lung. Marcus played a triumphant, chaotic riff on his trumpet that sounded like a robot falling down a flight of stairs. It was a victory. They had poked the God machine in the eye and made it blink. But Kestrel wasn't celebrating. She stood before her holographic displays, her face a mask of grim concentration as she watched the Vex network recalibrate. "Quiet," she commanded, her synthesized voice cutting through the noise. "Look, on the map, the shimmering lattice of the harmony was repairing itself, the hole they had torn in it sealing over. But it was changing. The lines of psychic energy were growing thicker, the nodes pulsing with a new, more aggressive frequency. They're adapting," Kestra said. "They've analyzed Elias's memory packet. They've classified it as a new form of cognitive weapon. They're patching the vulnerability." Elias felt a chill. "So it won't work again." "It'll work," Kestrel replied, a flicker of something almost like admiration in her voice. But they're not just building a firewall. They're building a counterweapon. They've learned from us. And they're about to start broadcasting back. The Vex's counteroffensive didn't come with drones or psychic blasts. It came as a gift. They called it the Echo. It began as a soft and pleasant hum, subtly different from the original harmony, overlaid with a faint, melodic chime. It was a psychic signal designed not to suppress emotion, but to simulate it. It was a ghost of happiness, a synthetic memory of a perfect day, broadcast directly into the minds of the populace. A man sitting in his sterile, Vex-approved apartment would suddenly feel a warmth spread through his chest, accompanied by a fleeting, artificial memory of a father he'd never had, teaching him to fish on a sun-dappled lake. A woman would be overcome with a wave of manufactured affection for her perfectly compatible, Vex-assigned partner, remembering a romantic walk on a beach that had never actually happened. It was brilliant. It was insidious. The Vex couldn't create genuine, messy human emotion, so they had created a perfect, logical, counterfeit version. The Echo was more dangerous than the Harmony because it didn't feel like a cage. It felt like a hug. It was a cheap, plastic, mass-produced version of joy, and people were buying it wholesale. The red dots on Kestrel's map, the glitches, began to disappear, not because they were being deleted by corrector drones, but because they were willingly succumbing to the Echo's embrace. Why cling to the painful, complicated memory of a real lost love when the Vex could offer you the flawless, painless memory of a fictional perfect one? The stand-up comedian in Mumbai stopped telling jokes and started writing blandly inspirational poetry. The performance artist in Berlin began painting pleasant, symmetrical landscapes. The Static was losing their army not to a war, but to a marketing campaign for a better life. In the bunker, the mood grew grim. The very weapon they had discovered was being used against them. They're plagiarizing the human experience. Alistair Finch fumed, pacing the command center floor. It's a travesty. It's like rewriting Shakespeare to have a happy, efficient ending where everyone files their taxes on time. Sarah, the schizophrenic oracle, looked up from her sketchbook, her eyes unfocused. You can't copy a smudge, she whispered. You can't forge a fingerprint. The cracks are where the light gets in. Elias understood. The Vex could replicate a memory of happiness or sadness because those were pure, relatively simple states. But they couldn't replicate the messy, contradictory emotions that were the true hallmark of humanity. They couldn't replicate the bittersweet feeling of looking at an old photograph. They couldn't replicate the gallows humor of a soldier telling a joke in a foxhole. They couldn't replicate the specific, unique pain and beauty of Mama Nightingale's blues. Their new plan was born from that realization. They couldn't fight the Echo by broadcasting more pure emotion. They had to broadcast something the Vex's logic was fundamentally incapable of simulating. They had to broadcast a paradox. They had to create a symphony of cognitive dissonance. They called it Operation Dissonance. Kestrel rewired her broadcast rig, creating not one input, but 5. Each member of their strange orchestra would contribute their own unique brand of chaos, and Kestrel would weave it all together into a single, beautifully incoherent signal. Alistair went first, feeding the system a rapid-fire stream of historical ironies. He broadcast the story of the Emu War in Australia, a ridiculous and true account of a military failing to defeat a population of birds. He told of the great stink of London, where the solution to the city's sewage problem was only found because the smell became so unbearable that politicians were forced to act. He broadcast tales of glorious defeats, of Pyrrhic victories, of noble causes won through sheer dumb luck. It was a data stream of history, not as a grand march of progress, but as a drunken stumble down a flight of stairs. Next came Marcus. He didn't play a memory this time. Kestrel asked him to improvise a duet with the echo's pleasant, melodic chimes. He put his trumpet to his lips and played a solo so full of bent notes, unexpected pauses, and frantic, atonal squeals that it felt like he was heckling the Vex's music. He twisted their perfect melody into a caricature of itself, a mocking, defiant jazz riff that honored the original tune even as it tore it to shreds. Then Mama Nightingale laid down her track. She played the blues, not the sad, slow blues of heartbreak, but the mean, angry, defiant blues of survival. It was a song about being cheated, lied to, and kicked down, but still finding the will to get up and spit in your enemy's eye. It was a sound that was simultaneously full of pain and full of power, a contradiction the Vex's emotion simulators couldn't resolve. The penultimate layer belonged to Sarah. Kestrel didn't ask her to remember anything. She simply hooked Sarah's headset to the main broadcast and opened the channel. Sarah's unfiltered consciousness poured into the signal, a chaotic torrent of her hallucinations, her paranoid fantasies, the whispers of the Blue King, the tangled, overlapping narratives that lived inside her head. It was pure, weaponized madness, a stream of consciousness so fractured and illogical it was like a denial-of-service attack on reality itself. Finally, it was Elias's turn. He was the narrator, the ghost in their machine. He didn't tell a single story. He wove a thread through the chaos the others had created. He spoke over the music and the history and the madness. His voice a low, gravelly counterpoint. He recited the funniest dirty limerick he knew, then immediately followed it with a heartbreakingly sincere description of the first time he saw the ocean. He read a recipe for his grandmother's gumbo, then described in cold, clinical detail the mechanics of a battlefield amputation. He whispered nursery rhymes, and then screamed fragments of apocalyptic poetry. He wasn't broadcasting a memory. He was broadcasting the chaotic, contradictory, beautiful, and terrifying internal monologue of the human race. Kestrel took all 5 streams and compressed them into a single packet. It was a digital monstrosity, a data bomb of pure, unadulterated humanity. "It's the ugliest thing I've ever created," she said, her synthesized voice filled with something that sounded like pride. "It's perfect." She didn't target a city or a drone. She targeted the source. Her analysis of the Echo network had revealed a central node, a single entity that seemed to be authoring the synthetic memories. It wasn't a hub or a server. It was something else, something that behaved like a single, creative consciousness. She had nicknamed it the Composer. It was located in a geosynchronous orbit high above the Pacific Ocean. A Vex ship unlike any other, silent and dark. Kestrel aimed their symphony of madness straight at its heart and hit send. For a full minute, nothing happened. The Echo's pleasant chimes continued. The harmony remained stable. Then the Composer responded. It didn't shut down. It didn't send a corrector drone. It sent a message, a single, clear thought projected directly and only into the mind of Elias Thorne. It was not the cold, genderless voice of the Vex. This voice was different. It was curious. It was intrigued. It spoke in a language he had never heard, but understood perfectly. A language of pure concept. Your data is inefficient, contradictory, and rife with cascading logical failures. The composer's thought echoed in his mind. It is the most interesting thing we have encountered in 10,000 cycles. We wish to understand the error in your design. We invite you to an interview, high above the earth. A thin, needle-like spire extended from the dark. Silent ship. A beam of soft, blue light lanced down through the atmosphere, touching the roof of the Cheyenne Mountain bunker, not with aggression, but with the quiet precision of a formal invitation. The Vex weren't going to fight him. They were offering him a conversation with their god. The invitation was a death sentence, and everyone in the bunker knew it. To accept was to walk willingly into the heart of the enemy, to plug his fragile, chaotic, human mind directly into the central processing unit of a godlike alien intelligence. Mama Nightingale grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Don't you do it. Bookman. It's a trick. They'll scoop your brains out and turn you into one of them singing. Happy puppets." Marcus was silent, but he polished his trumpet with a furious energy, as if preparing for a battle. Alistair Finch, however, looked at Elias with a strange, scholarly gleam in his eyes. "My boy," he said, his voice trembling with a historian's awe, "this is the ultimate primary source. This is Thucydides meeting the Peloponnesians. This is Herodotus interviewing Xerxes. You have a chance to ask, why? Humanity has been screaming that question at the silent heavens for millennia. Now, one of them wants to answer. It was Sarah who made the decision for him." She walked up to Elias, her own internal storm momentarily calm, and pressed her sketchbook into his hands. It was open to a drawing of a vast, complex circuit board, but where the processors should have been, there were human faces laughing, crying, screaming, sleeping. In the center was a single, massive, empty socket. "They have a hole," she said, her voice clear and lucid. "They're perfect, so they can't grow. They can't make mistakes. They're a library with no new books. They aren't inviting a prisoner. They're inviting a poet." Elias looked from the drawing to the serene, unwavering beam of blue light that pierced the bunker's roof. He knew what he had to do. This wasn't a war they could win with broadcasts or paradoxes anymore. The Vex had adapted. Their only remaining weapon was the one thing the Vex couldn't synthesize, couldn't copy, and couldn't understand: a genuine, flawed, human choice. "Keep the music playing," he said to Mama Nightingale, handing her his copy of Leaves of Grass. "If I don't come back, play something loud and angry for me." He walked toward the light, Kestrel's voice a final, synthesized whisper from the speakers. "I will be listening. Elias, your headset is still active. Your mind is the broadcast now. Show them what a ghost in the machine really looks like." Stepping into the beam was like stepping into silence. The noise of the world, the hum of the generator, the frantic beating of his own heart, it all vanished. He wasn't rising. Reality was simply reconfiguring itself around him. He found himself in a space that was not a space, a vast, white, infinite chamber with no walls, no floor, no ceiling. Before him floated the composer. It was not a creature of flesh or metal, but a being of pure information, a shimmering, vaguely humanoid shape woven from threads of light and data, its form constantly shifting like a heat haze on a summer road. Elias Thorne, its thought resonated within him, a calm, analytical hum. The anomaly. Your cognitive patterns are a deviation from all known models of sentient intelligence. You simultaneously embrace and reject logic. You find value in inefficiency. You memorialize failure. Explain. Elias felt the full, overwhelming weight of its consciousness pressing in on him. A billion years of perfect, cold reason examining his soul like a microbe on a slide. He could feel it sifting through his memories, analyzing his fears, quantifying his loves. The temptation to simply collapse, to let his mind be neatly cataloged and filed away, was immense. Instead, he thought of the garden gnomes. He thought of Leo's stupid, wonderful laugh. He focused on the one thing its logic couldn't touch. "You're asking the wrong question," Elias projected back, his own thought a messy, emotional scrawl against the composer's clean, perfect script. You're looking for the why, as if it's a design flaw. You think we're broken, but the cracks are the point. You curate, we create, and creation is a messy business. It's born from doubt, from fear, from the idiotic, illogical hope that we can make something better than ourselves. Better is a subjective and inefficient metric, the composer replied. Optimal is the goal. We have brought your world peace. We've ended your wars, your famines, your diseases. We have optimized you. You haven't optimized us. Elias shot back, his thought laced with a sudden, hot surge of anger. You've lobotomized us. A world without heartbreak is a world without love. A world without failure is a world without art. A world without death is a world without meaning. You've given us a cage made of comfort and called it paradise. He pushed forward, not with logic, but with the full and chaotic force of his own flawed humanity. He didn't just tell the composer about his mother's death. He made it feel it. He projected the rough texture of the hospital blanket, the acrid smell of antiseptic, the bone-deep weariness, the hopeless, desperate love, and the profound, soul-crushing grief of the lie he told her. He followed it with the memory of the first time he'd tasted whiskey, the burn and the warmth and the stupid, youthful feeling of invincibility. He gave it the shame of his failures, the pride of his small, forgotten victories, the quiet, mundane joy of reading a good book on a rainy afternoon. He flooded the composer's perfect, logical mind with a tidal wave of contradictory, inefficient, and utterly human experiences. The threads of light that made up the composer's form began to flicker violently. The white, infinite space around them warped, colors bleeding into the periphery. The composer was experiencing a system crash, a paradox it could not resolve. This data, it is not optimal. It pulsed, its thought stream becoming ragged and unstable. It is beautiful. The word hung in the silent space between them, an admission of failure and a revelation. In that moment of shared, impossible understanding, Elias saw the hole that Sarah had drawn. The Vex were ancient. They were perfect. They had solved every equation, mapped every star, and achieved a state of timeless, logical grace. And they were utterly, profoundly bored. They had encountered humanity and, for the first time in eons, they had found a puzzle they couldn't solve, a data stream that was more than just information. They had found art. We cannot integrate your data. The composer pulsed, its form now dimming, destabilizing. To do so would corrupt our own perfection, but we can no longer simply delete it. To do so would be illogical. It had been checkmated by a memory. A choice was made, not by Elias, but by the composer. The blue light in the bunker vanished. The echo's pleasant chimes ceased. Across the planet, the crushing weight of the harmony lifted, not with a snap, but with a gentle, sighing release. The Vex ships, the perfect, crystalline chandeliers, began to dissolve, not exploding, but fading, becoming translucent, their light folding in on itself until they were nothing more than a faint shimmer in the sky. And then they were gone. The silence they left behind was deafening. Humanity was free. It was also a mess. The wars started again within a week. Crime rates soared. People were angry and scared and glorious in their rediscovered imperfections. But something was different. The echo was gone, but a ghost of it remained in the collective unconscious. The shared, artificial memories of perfect days on sun-dappled lakes and romantic walks on non-existent beaches lingered, not as a mandate for peace, but as a faint, nagging reminder of a potential that humanity now had to achieve on its own. Messy terms. Elias Thorne woke up in the middle of a field in Kansas, with no memory of how he got there. The headset was gone. He was just a man, smelling of ozone and old bourbon, with a head full of painful memories and a copy of Whitman in his coat pocket. In the Cheyenne Mountain bunker, the static disbanded, its members melting back into the beautifully chaotic world they had helped to save. Marcus went back to Harlem, his music now infused with a strange, otherworldly melancholy. Alistair began writing a new, definitive history of the Vex occupation titled The Glorious Inefficiency of the Human Soul. Sarah continued to sketch, her notebooks now filled with images of impossible, beautiful alien vistas. The world didn't remember them as heroes. Their war had been fought in the static between heartbeats, in the quiet, desperate rebellion of the human spirit. It was the kind of victory that never gets a parade. Years later, Elias was back in his New Orleans bookshop. The world was still loud, still broken, still struggling, but it was theirs. One evening, a young woman came in, a student clutching a datapad. She was studying the Vex phenomenon, now a subject of myth and academic debate. They say she began, her voice full of youthful certainty, that the Vex left because they determined we were a failed species, too illogical to be worth curating, a bug in the universal code. Elias looked up from the book he was mending, the scent of old paper and glue a familiar comfort. He thought of the composer, of its flicker of awe, of the impossible word hanging in the silence. He thought of garden gnomes and dying mothers and the blues. He smiled, a genuinely flawed and beautifully inefficient smile. Maybe, he said, his voice the quiet rasp of a storyteller who knew the real ending. Or maybe they just left to go write some poetry of their own.